Everybody has a story, and every story needs to be heard. On this podcast, we are talking with each member of the General Conference Leadership Council. I'm not your host. Alyssa Truman is your host. I am Sam Neves, and I'm stepping in for her because today we are hearing about her story on here, A&N Profiles, which is this podcast. She's the Assistant Director of Communication for the General Conference. Hey, Alyssa.
Hey, Sam.
So let's talk about your story, huh?
I guess that's why we're here, right?
Okay.
I got to do it to you, so I feel like, this feels right. Like, now, after I put you through all of that, now you get to...
Vengeance.
Yeah. Let's just say we're turning the tables. That sounds a lot better.
Yes. All right. So most people don't know you. They just hear you ask questions of everybody else. Let's talk about little Alyssa first. Where did you grow up and how was that experience?
I grew up in upstate New York, New York State, which is in the United States. And I grew up in what is, I think at the time, was the second snowiest city in all of America. And I remember snow, like deep snow, like we could go out our second story windows and walk onto it, snow. So I grew up in this very cold area, but I grew up in this very family-centric unit as well. So I grew up in my home church. I was raised a Seventh-day Adventist, and my home church was made up of about 80% my relatives. And there's probably about 150 people in there. So when
people said the church family.
We literally really meant the church family. That's what we thought it actually meant. So my parents fell in love when they were in high school. And my mom came from one side of the family that had a ton of siblings. And my dad came from another family that had a ton of siblings within the Adventist Church. Everyone knew if you were a foot or a caster. And I was the marriage blended version of both of them. So that's kind of like where I grew up. And yeah.
Okay. So that's the beginning of the story.
Yes.
Today you lead the news, the public relations news for the Adventist World Church, and also lead the social media channels of the Adventist World Church. Let's see how we got from one end to the next.
It's a little bit drastic here. It's going to be a very fun story, Sam.
There is a journey here somewhere. Okay, so you were growing up in the cold with lots of Adventists. What was school like?
School. I actually went to a Adventist school. I've gone through Adventist education my entire life. And I went to a small, I wouldn't call it a one-room schoolhouse, but it might as well have been. I remember like one year we had like 12 students. I think the most we ever had in my elementary years were like maybe 16, 17 students.
So very small classes.
So basically we'd actually put all the first through fourth graders in one classroom and the fifth through eighth graders in one. And so like when it was math period, they would call up the first graders and then they'd call up the second graders and then the third graders and then the fourth graders. And then when your time was done, you would go back and you would do your schoolwork. So like we never had homework because there was so much time built in that we just would do it all while we're sitting there. And I'm semi-competitive, so I was going to get it done at school anyways because I wanted to go home and have fun. So I went through Adventist schooling.
Most people have no concept of what that means. Having a class with multiple grades in the same class.
It is a weird concept, but it actually is a really cool concept. It's actually something I kind of love about Adventist education and our smaller schools because there's a way to mentor and help other people. So if the teacher is busy helping somebody else, if there's somebody who's a grade above you, you can go and ask them. So it reinforces their learning as well as at the same time teaching you. And we talk a lot about Adventist education and like how, at least here in America, it's kind of a little bit scholastically, we test really, really well. I actually think most of our schools in North America are smaller schools. And I think that this might be one of the reasons. This is my total like non-researched. But because we actually, there's a lot of this collaborative learning and you're constantly hearing, as you can hear a teacher maybe speak to the other classmates, it's also reinforcing the learning you learned last year. You're hearing a little bit of what you could be learning the next year. And I always loved
Cool.
learning. I loved education. It's kind of my thing. So I loved school.
Okay, so you've got this multi-generational classroom, and now you are in high school. Anything
Well,
that,
we just jumped really quick. I'm not done with. I'm
yeah,
I'm
so
gonna visit a few more things
let's go
first.
through the main elements of, or the most transformative event of your childhood that you think had an impact in who you are today.
I'm going to. I was like, we're not going to jump to high school yet. And I've learned this from other people when they interrupt me and just decide that, yeah, that's not how the story is going to go. So I would say there's three things that really help transform who I am. One is my family. My parents allowed me to be incredibly creative since I was young. This is probably one of the greatest gifts that they ever gave me.
How do you teach creativity?
You don't hamper it. Kids are born, I believe, to be creative. We all want to have this creative thing. But at a certain point in our lives, I think that we're called on to be more mature, or we aren't allowed to just kind of like let it go. So we grew up in this unfinished home. So like it was like first floor and second floor. The second floor was finished, but the first floor never quite got finished. But because of that, my parents let me take these rooms and we would kind of decorate them, and I would make them into like Alyssa's travel agency or Alyssa's shoe shop or Alyssa's this, or it was always Alyssa's. My poor younger sister just got stuck playing along. But like I would make this travel agency and I would make tickets and passports.
You have sisters.
I do. I have two sisters.
Let's imagine them playing with you. What are they like? Younger, older?
My older sister is Amy, and she was, I love you, Amy, if you're listening. She was like the older sister. She was kind of bossy. Rightfully so. She would try to like get us to do the things that we kind of needed to do because
All older siblings are bossy.
both of my parents were self-employed my entire life. And so they were rarely home. We were what they called in America latchkey kids in the 1980s, which basically meant we came home from school and we were on our own until our parents came home. There wasn't a parent who was staying home with us. For a few years, many years, my parents did have a job where they would work from home, but they were so busy that we would do a lot of stuff ourselves. So my older sister thought she was the mother. But really she was just trying to help make sure that we did the things that we needed to get done. But you know, as a child, you're like, you're not my mom. And she's like, but yeah, it was a great thing. My younger sister was, she just loved to get along with us and we would play together and we would just have fun. Her name's Ashley. And yes, so I was always suckering her into whatever it is that I had envisioned. So I collected stamps with my grandmother, who made a huge impact in my life. My grandmother was a prayer warrior. And we would collect stamps. And I remember getting stamps. She would give me an envelope full of stamps to put into my stamp album. And they would always be in like AWR envelopes or, you know, things like this. And because she would always get all of this literature and she was faithful in giving to the church. It was always a part of her life. And so even at a young age, I was seeing all of this stuff. But so this creativity. So my dad had a woodworking area in our basement, bandsaws, sanders, a whole room just for spray painting. And when I was young, I mean, I would go down there and once he knew that we knew how to use it, I would just go down there and I would be working on a bandsaw, using a radial arm saw. To me, this is just like a no-brainer. I realize now that that's not really something that most 9-year-old girls are doing. My mom would have this whole sewing area and cross-stitch and stuff. So we could use all of that stuff. So like just whatever we wanted, I could just be creative. And they never stopped us. They never discouraged us from going down there and using all of their stuff.
But wasn't it dangerous and wouldn't it become a mess at some point?
Oh, at some point I would get in trouble for yes. And sometimes I did get in trouble because I was not always the neatest. But even still, it never was. I would get in trouble for not maintaining the neatness, but never to the point
Of not being
where I
able to
was
keep playing.
encouraged not to be creative. And I remember we took one whole room and we made box tunnels in it and created like rooms out of fabric, like with tents and canopies ourselves. And we just got to live life and just have fun. Obviously, this is in the days before a computer.
How much do you think screens are stopping the little Alyssas of today from becoming creative in their future?
Oh, that's so harsh. It is. I mean, it is. It's
Because if we remove the autonomy of experimentation and we remove the spaces and the ability to try things that could become messy, surely the end result of that upbringing will be very different to what you had experienced.
It is. I mean, research shows that. This isn't some genius thing. It's not like my other thing where I just think that this might be one of the reasons why Adventist education is great. This is like proven. We are losing we're losing a generation right now to creativity unless we empower them. And it's kind of scary. We're scared about AI, but we still put our kids in front of computers,
Yeah.
So that was number one. No,
Okay.
sorry. I'm going to keep going. Pathfinders. Pathfinders was something else that was essential to my life.
You and your family members who were part of
Hey,
this church.
stop. We had like one of the best clubs in New York. I'm going to say the best club in New York. We participated in all the things. I remember campouts. What I really remember was, because not everyone, remember, was related to me. Our Pathfinder leaders were never actually my relatives, interestingly enough. I always felt so cared for and loved by them. Like, it created these really positive memories. I remember making cakes and doing the cake decorating on it. I remember candle making. All those camping skills. This was back in the day when we loved to have our hair sprayed, and we would sometimes, as girls, we would put the hairspray on the kindling to try to beat the boys and who could make a fire faster. Unsurprisingly, we won. But
Look at you being
Pathfinders,
competitive.
what a shock. That might be a thread through this whole entire thing. But one of the things that Pathfinders also gave me was this, well, it gave me the zeal for learning. So like all these honors, like I wanted to do them all. For one birthday, I asked for a Pathfinder honor book as my birthday gift. And that summer, me and my cousin Tara, we actually just went through them and we just started earning honors like crazy, just because what we really wanted was just like to learn and to experiment, because you never know what you're going to be interested in life. And Pathfinders is this great way to explore so many things on kind of not a super deep level, but then kind of opens your understanding to something so that you can be like, actually, I really love this. And you can kind of keep going with it.
So in Pathfinders, you understood the rules of the game. There's a book with the honors. And how do I get those little things on my uniform? I learn.
Which I didn't mind.
Okay, let's go.
But the other thing that I loved about Pathfinders was it was actually the first opportunity that I was ever given to preach. So I was 12 when I preached my first sermon as a Pathfinder for Pathfinder Sabbath. And that was probably one of the most pivotal moments in my life.
How so?
So one, I didn't have anybody help me prepare it. I prepared this completely on my own. And there's something about walking out onto the platform and kneeling and singing the songs and that what people would call a ritual. It felt so holy to me in that moment. And I remember as I was preaching, which I spoke probably way too fast. Actually, I know I spoke way too fast. That's when I felt called to ministry. I felt like this was something I knew, like there was something so special about that experience. It wasn't because everyone told me I did a great job, which many people did. It was the holiness of standing on that platform. It was a sacred feeling, and I felt very called to ministry at that moment. And that calling kept coming back at different phases in my life. But that was the moment. It wasn't my baptism.
Nice.
It was preaching as a Pathfinder up front.
Interesting. Well, I've been trying to encourage you to do a whole series
Yeah.
somewhere. So this is
That's
very,
cute.
very good information.
I feel like this may be used against me
It
at some point
will.
in the
It will.
future.
Yes.
So
So that's two.
Pathfinders, and then the last one was church family. Like, I know we kind of joked about that a little bit. I always felt loved in my church. They were always willing to involve us young people. And I felt that from a very young age. Church was a happy place for me. I remember my mom was the head deaconess. My dad was the head elder or head deacon at different times. And he would also do the AV. We would arrive at church before everyone else came. And we were always like the last ones to leave. And we would all be talking and laughing, and our cousins would be there, and we'd all be just kind of like hanging out. And it was just like this beautiful place. Did we all get along? No. I know there are family squabbles. Like, I know that there was other drama that was happening. Sometimes we didn't have a pastor for months and months. And yet this was like this place where you could just go and it felt like home. And I feel that sense when I walk into many churches. Not every church, but you feel this specialness. Like when you walk into my personal home, when my kids come there, my home is where my family is. That was also my family. So when I walked in, it felt like coming home.
So you felt love and belonging at home. You felt love and belonging in Pathfinders. You felt love and belonging at church. Was it the same at school?
No. My school years were actually very hard. I was bullied a lot. I had one teacher who said some things that kids should never have to hear, to demean your worth and your value, that I've spent years having run around in my head, telling me that I was not worthy. I would never make anything out of myself in life. So no, it was not always easy.
That is the opposite of what a teacher should say.
The bullying was so bad between 5th and 6th grade that my parents actually pulled me out in 7th grade. And remember, this is mostly family. So these are mostly cousins and other people. We were kids. We were young. I forgive them all. I've forgiven them many, many years ago. I was pulled out my 7th grade year. I asked to go back my 8th grade year because I wanted to have a real traditional graduation. But school was never my safe place. It was never my happy place. I sometimes think it's a miracle I send my kids to Adventist education because of it. But the thing is, I can see beyond what my experience was because I know so many others' experiences were different. But those experiences were something that took me many years into my life. And I still struggle with. It's kind of like here in the back of my brain. It's getting lessened, but I always hear those voices. Sometimes they're just more muted than others. And I'm hoping that someday with this power of the Holy Spirit that they will be gone. But no. And another thing is like, I've made it sound like we have a very picturesque life, although that does not. I actually grew up very poor. We were not wealthy. My parents were self-employed in what I believe is probably one of the poorest areas of the state of New York. And I do remember at times where we would struggle to pay for heat. And I remember at times not having heat. And we've talked about how cold it was there. I remember at times not really having a lot of food in the home. My parents did their absolute best to provide for us. But they struggled. They struggled to make ends meet. I never doubted their love for us. But in a home where money is not always available, it does make it so that there is sometimes more friction and more tension. But my parents actually, about when I turned 13, was actually when, although they were Adventists, my parents also had their conversion experience. So you can be an Adventist, as we all know, but doesn't really mean that you are a Christian, that you have this like burning in your desire for God. You can be culturally an Adventist. And I don't remember what exactly triggered it, but they started reading the Spirit of Prophecy and their Bibles. I didn't really love this period of time. They also decided that we were going to become vegan at this time. We were vegetarian before. I've always been a vegetarian, but I just remember it was like very sudden, very quick changes. And I was at those years where you're kind of pushing back anyways. But even still, like I knew my parents loved me, and as I ended up having my own conversion experience, I could sense where that zeal that they had came from. And just seeing them do the things that they did kind of helped me as I kind of as I started heading toward my teenage years.
So you're now a teenager.
I am.
What happened?
Okay. I went away to boarding school. So this is very common. Back then it was very common. So I went away to a boarding academy. It was probably also not the best year of my life. It was my first time being out. I was 14 years old. I kind of went through some rebellious stuff. It was not the most positive thing in my life at that time. But I had a teacher. He was a music teacher. His name is Bob Mills. And Bob and his, I think, fiance at that time had actually been call porter leaders the summer before for my older sister, Amy. So she had her conversion experience, went off. She was a call porter, and then she went to AUC, met her husband. I went to academy, and I was like living in my sister's shadow. She was smart. She's brilliant. Okay. So I felt like I was living in her shadow, but Bob came alongside me and he encouraged me. He inspired me a lot. I fell in love with singing in choir there. And then at the end of that year, they invited me to, I started call portering. I decided to join the summer call porter program. So between my freshman and sophomore years in academy, for 10 weeks, I was a student literature evangelist.
Define what that means for us.
Yes. So for those of you who have not heard me make other people define this, now I get to define it. A student literature evangelist, basically you go door to door selling books. I'm not going to say it the way you always say it. I would sell books. So cookbooks, children's storybooks, like Uncle Arthur's Bedtime Stories, Desire of Ages, all those, just like good books, Great Controversy, Steps to Christ. And you would knock on doors like 8 hours a day. And one day I was in Rochester, New York. My older sister was one of my leaders, and I twisted my ankle. And being who I am, I kept going on this twist ankle until it got so painful I could not do it. And so I got in the car, and my sister happened to be my leader that day. And I started praying. She'd be like, well, if you can't work, you can pray. So I would start praying for people. As soon as I would pray, they would call on the walkie-talkies and they'd be like, I need books. I just sold a bunch of books. And so this happened throughout the day. I would pray for them. People would sell their books. Then I would go out and I would sell my books for a while until it got too painful. Then I'd get back in the car and the same thing would repeat. And at some point, it's like I could sense like the Holy Spirit. This was his moment. And he was like knocking and he was like, I'm going to show you what I can do. And we came back to where we were staying that night, and we were staying in these apartment buildings, Lockport, New York. That's the actual name of the city. And I remember I went up to the rooftop and I had it out with God. Like, here I am. I'm like being a call porter. Like, obviously I'm so spiritual. No, like I wanted this relationship with God. I needed money for school. It made sense. But that commitment to God is a very scary thing. Like that real full surrender. Anything and everything I have is yours. So I was standing on this rooftop. And I was just like, I was looking out. You could see the whole city of Lockport and all these lights. And I was just like, God, I don't want to give it up. Like, there's things I want. It's hard. And I kept getting this impression in my head to turn around. And I would kind of keep talking with God. And I finally turned around and I looked, and I'd never seen it before. I don't know how I missed it. But on the other side of the apartments was just this like hill, just solitary hill. And it had a telephone post on it. And the telephone post was like in the perfect shape of a cross. And there was a single light just focused on this telephone pole. And all of a sudden, the words to a song that I had sung so many times came to my head. The world before me, the world behind me, the cross before me, no turning back. And so I have decided to follow Jesus. And in that moment, I fell to my knees and I gave my life to him. I went downstairs. I told all of my leaders. Bob was there, his fiancee, Virginia, my sister. And that was probably the second moment. So when I was standing as a Pathfinder, I felt the call. This was that secondary call to ministry. Like I felt it. So I actually changed academies. I knew if I went back to the academy I was at, it wasn't gonna end where I needed it to end. And Bob and Virginia were getting married, and he had just accepted to be an assistant boys dean at another academy. And so 4 weeks before the next school year started, I broke all family tradition, which generations had, like literally my grandmother, aunts, uncles, everyone had always gone to the academy I went to. And we went out of union, which meant it was going to cost us more money. My parents were not wealthy. Like this, there was nothing about this that made sense. But I knew, and my parents knew, that this is what I needed to do. And so they supported me. My grandmother, who had been praying for me, helped financially. And so I transferred. I went to Blue Mountain Academy and became a class pastor, the essay pastor. And every summer I would call Porter to earn my way to go to school. And I had the opportunity to preach all over Pennsylvania as a student. I preached to my classmates, went on mission trips, and felt very convicted that I was called to work for the church. So that's like my high school years in a.
That's amazing. Why do you think there is a higher proportion of leaders in the Adventist Church who have colported compared to those that haven't?
Oh, I don't think anyone's ever asked me that.
That's the whole point of being interviewed.
That's
is
great.
To,
That's
to
great.
answer questions you've never been asked
to think
before.
about my life. It's hard. It's really, really, really hard. At the end of that, I find that you come out one of two ways. Like you're kind of like done, or you're like all in. You have to learn how to deal with crisis. You have to learn how to deal with objections. You have to learn how to get along with each other, because it's like all these people and you're all just like in this close area for like 10 weeks. You know, to me, it was way worse than being in a dorm, because it's like for us, it was like 10 girls all packed into this one room. You know, it's like, I kind of like my personal space. Not my favorite thing to be packed in a room. So I think you learn people skills. You also learn how to understand people, to empathize with them. You learn to be good at observing stuff. When I'm walking up to the house, do I see kids' toys on the lawn? If so, that might be an indication that kids live there. You know, you become an observer of things.
You communicate better because that's what you're doing all day. And if you fail to communicate, you fail.
And I think that at the heart of it, if you really want to, so these are all great leadership things, but why do we become church leaders? It's because if you really want to sell the books that are meaningful, one, they have to transform your life. So you read the books that you're selling. So I read The Great Controversy. I read The Desire of Ages. I read Ministry of Healing. And if you truly believe what is in those books and you're trying to get other people to be inspired by the same thing you read, it changes who you are. So you're not just changing other people's lives, it's changing you. So I think in that aspect, it adds to that spiritual leadership, because now I'm bought in. I see it. I understand it because it makes sense to me.
And you have to pray and all the rest of it. Interesting. Okay, so now you finish your teenage years
I'm still a teenager when I go to college.
and, well, you go to college. Where do you go and why?
So I actually went to a mission college. I'm going to call it a mission college because that's what most of us people would know it as now.
What does that mean?
So it's not a traditional college. So I didn't go to like um, Atlantic Union College at that time, which would have been what was in my territory, which is not there anymore, but like Southern, Andrews, like all these places in America. So just to be clear from the outset of this, until I was like married, I went on short mission trips, but I never really left the country. So I'm an American here for the whole duration of this thing. So I never really traveled out of America. So all these Adventist colleges would seem where I would go. But because of my conversion experience and because I had this call porter experience and greatly because of Bob Mills, at the end of my senior year, Bob Mills accepted a call to teach at a mission college. So you can see Bob very much as pivotal in many moments in my life.
Mm-hmm.
So I decide I'm going to go to this college. So you basically can earn like 2 degrees, religion or religious education. It's fully accredited because it went through Griggs University. So we were doing like real schoolwork, fully accredited. You had to do all the typical things you would do, but it was in a very small, close-knit setting. So
Which you're very familiar with because that was all your life so far.
Yeah, pretty much. I've never had a real like large school setting. I mean, my academy years were probably the largest. I think there were 200 students there. So that was,
Careful.
crazy. So it was while we were there, I took biblical preaching. I did all of the, these different classes. My degree that I selected was religion. So
Why?
Because I wanted to work for the church. I didn't want to be a teacher.
Did you want to be a pastor?
Yes.
Because you seem to have 2 calls. One, a call to ministry, and the other one, a call to discipleship. Which are not always the same. But okay, so now you're there studying.
So I wanted to be a pastor. I thought I could be a youth pastor. I poured myself into it, as I do with most everything in life. I loved it. I loved going around to preach. Actually, when I was 19, I was actually asked to come and to speak at the general conference. And I gave a morning,
I presume.
No, at the building here
Okay.
in this building. And I gave a morning worship. I still remember seeing faces in the audience that, you'd only heard of. And I still remember my talk was to stop calling the youth the church of tomorrow.
So you're 19 and you're telling all these old people, stop calling the youth the church of tomorrow.
We're the church of today. And I encourage them to mentor us, to come alongside us, because we're ready. We're ready to do the work.
And were you?
I mean, as ready as any 19-year-old is. But I mean, yeah. I mean, I was all in.
Bring it on.
So at this time, I also met the man who was going to become my husband. He did not go to college, but the college that I went to was on the campus of the Review and Herald Publishing House. So my husband was working for the Review and Herald. And so because our classes were there was like, he was like one of the younger people in the building. So we kind of met and he was kind of cute. I enjoyed flirting with him. But yes. So his name's Trent. I love him. So somewhere in my sophomore year, junior year, I was invited to go and preach somewhere. And the school was told to send a preacher. They were going to send me. And
you said, I will go.
I will go. Totally before it was even a thing.
Yes.
Total member involvement right here. So I was going to go. And then when they submitted my name to the church and let them know who was coming, they were told not to send me. This was actually a church that had family ties to me. They even would know who I was. But they didn't want me to come because I was a female. And I remember talking with one of my teachers, and they basically said that the church will never have a place for you. And it kind of crushed me because since I was 12, this is all I've wanted. Like, I just wanted to work for the church. I wanted to use my talents and gifts for the church. And I didn't know what to do. So I got married.
When in doubt,
Get married.
get married.
I mean, I was going to get married anyways. I'd finished, I'd graduated. But I just went, I ended up working at Highland View Academy in their business office for 3 years as like a business office assistant. So I was the one sending out bills and calling people and making payment plans and helping kids get student jobs, and taught typing class, those poor students. And I was this newlywed and loving my life, enjoying every minute of it. But when my husband and I got married, I also told him something that was, when I have children, I was going to stay at home. So 3 years into our marriage, we had my first child, Maria, and I went and stayed home. And interestingly, the call that I felt never actually, even those 3 years, it never went away. And I kept thinking like, oh, maybe he wants me to work in the academy as a bit. He did not. Like,
It wasn't.
it was a placeholder. I mean, I learned some very valuable skills. But I am not cut out to be a business office person for the rest of my life. But when I had kids, that calling felt like it kind of went away. I just didn't have that same strength as it used to have. So I ended up having 3 daughters, Maria, Riley, Ellie, within 2 years of each other. So we had a 23-month plan and we stuck to it and nailed it. So we had our children. I stayed home with them. I loved being a stay-at-home mom. I loved it. I loved reading to them and playing with them. It was not easy though. Parenting is not easy. But I felt very fulfilled from it. Yeah. I'll let you have a leading question now. You're welcome.
I know all 3 of them,
You do.
and they are brilliant.
Just like their mom. No, I'm just joking.
And
I've got to give my husband some props here.
So Trent is a designer, also creative.
Yes.
How did that affect your children, positively or negatively? You're very creative. He's very creative. And you were at home for a number of years.
14.
14.
I stayed home with my children for 14 years.
Did you work in that time?
I did. I'm going to answer the first question. You might have to remind me of the second question.
No problem.
So I think because of how my parents raised me to allow us to be creative, and then my husband already being creative, my children, I don't necessarily think it's a genetic trait, but I'm not going to outrule it. My kids are all very creative. And we just allowed them to explore anything and everything that they wanted. For a while, one of my daughters was certain she was going to be an astronaut. So anytime we went to the store, if there was a magazine, like a Time thing about like Mars, I'd buy it for her. She wanted to learn Russian for a while. So we got Duolingo app and she started learning Russian, because if you're going to be an astronaut, you're going to need to like interact with cosmonauts. So like we knew the whole thing. And so I think my children, not the same level, because screens did enter my kids' lives, but we tried to allow them to have this creativity. I remember my kids cutting up like pictures from magazines and like making their own little paper dolls, and they were hiding under their bed. And just like my mom, I would also get frustrated by this, but I never want to stop their creativity. I homeschooled them for about 2 or 3 years, and then I was done with that. I was like, as soon as the math outplaces me, it wasn't the math in the end. It was my health that ended up making it so I could not do it. But so we ended up sending them to a small Adventist school, although much larger than mine. I think there was like 100 kids there. So, much larger. And they loved school. So to answer the question about if I did work during that time, I did. I never was someone who could just kind of sit around. So I actually did a couple different things. So because my husband had this graphic design, I was going to say background, but actually it's his whole life. So because my husband's a graphic designer, we had access to tools like Photoshop and Illustrator and all this. So I just started playing around with them because it sounded like fun. So I taught myself graphic design, all the tools. I already had a natural eye to it. So I would have to sometimes get my husband to teach me how to use the tool to do what I wanted it to do. Interestingly, all my kids at a young age also started playing around with Photoshop. They all learned video editing and stuff, which is from my other job at very young ages. But so for a while, I actually designed scrapbook papers and like all the stuff that you could get. So it was all in the digital form. I sold at like one of the number one stores on the internet, and I I loved it. I loved the design. I loved the creativity of it. The other thing I did was I worked for a network marketing company. So I worked with Usborne Publishing at that time, and I did that for I don't know, a lot of years. We're just gonna go with a lot of years because I don't remember how many of them. And so we would sell kids' books. So it was kind of hearkening on the colporteuring, and but it
You
was
must have really liked this selling books thing.
well, the thing that I loved about it was I was able to get these books. I would earn books too. And so I've always been a reader. So we're merging all these things that I love. So my creativity is going to come out in this job, my reading, my parenting, my marketing. But something that had not really entered the equation before this was social media. Social media has been born. Facebook comes out right as I'm about joining this. So I'm learning how to start keeping in touch with other people through this. And we learned how to use the internet to sell things. So all of these skills that God is kind of, I think, not really randomly, He's putting together in me. I was able to involve my children. They would come to me at big events and they would cash people out. They would talk to people. They became my little sales force. It was so brilliant watching them work and to empower them to be able to do things. When YouTube became a big thing, I would create videos to like show my books. My children would be in the videos, or they actually got to the point where they were editing my videos. They would help me come up with social media content ideas.
So it became like a family business.
It really did. And it was actually very purposeful to do that. I wanted to involve them in it. But it also made my kids love reading. So my kids were reading like the Encyclopedia of Ancient History for fun. You know, they would read chapter books too, but like it allowed them to open their minds. And I loved giving them that opportunity. So I don't remember, like, because I'm really bad at timelines here, but I would say when my oldest was in about 6th grade. So I don't know where that is. I became very sick. I actually went away to one of our big conferences with my company. And when I came back, some people in our church had paid for me to go to a wellness center for 2 weeks. So I have a number of chronic illnesses that I was diagnosed with at 21 years old. So this is not HIPAA violation, I guess, if I say it there. So I struggle with fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome, and I have since 21. So I'm always in just like a little bit of pain, sometimes more pain than normal, because fibromyalgia is like a nerve thing. So you're just always like in pain. Like I'm in pain every episode that I'm sitting here. I'm always in a little bit of pain, not a ton, but I'm also tired a lot. So the chronic fatigue just exhausts me. So it had gotten to the place where a friend of mine actually is on disability. He can't even work. He has the same conditions I do. And I just was like, I never wanted, like, I can't do that. Like I want to keep doing something, but it had gotten so bad that I was in bed for like 2 months or something. Like I would kind of get out, but I wasn't really being able to do much. So I went to this wellness center, and it was actually the second day that I was there. I had had a hydrotherapy treatment. I remember I was very content. I was doing really, really well in these companies. So I actually quit doing the design, the scrapbooking work. I was doing branding design now. So I was doing branding. I was making logos and things like that for other people. But I was all in on the books at this point. And I was doing really well. I had like 1,000 people under me. I was earning trips. I was earning major awards.
This is network marketing.
Yes.
So it's all about how big the team you can lead and how
the thing is that you're having to inspire people
sales.
who don't necessarily want to work. So there is a certain level of like, you have to like inspire them. Everything's about inspiration. So like we were using Zoom before it was cool. We
You
would have
can't
these.
command them. You can't tell them what to do because they don't work for you.
No, they work for
But if they
themselves.
don't sell anything, you don't earn much either.
No, it's a it's a whole wonderful thing. But so like I'm doing really, really well. I'm loving what I do. It's meaningful, but there's always this part of me that feels a little bit that something's missing. Like, and my sister and I would talk about it, and we just both of us felt like she really felt called, because she was actually the one who brought me into it, my older sister. She felt called to be a teacher. She wanted to teach within Adventist education, but she had not finished her degree. So my sister decides to go back to school. She goes online and finishes her degree. And that was one of the most inspiring things I've ever seen. She's finished putting her kids through, like she actually homeschooled her oldest all the way through like up until the high school years.
Wow.
And I think he ended up going off to school at some point there. My brother-in-law went back to college. He had not finished his degree. He went back to college and became a pastor. And
Her husband.
Yes, her husband. And so here I am. I'm like, there's just this thing that's missing. So I'm laying on this hydrotherapy table, and like the worst thing for me is to be alone in my head. Like I like music. I need something going on around me. And I remember the moment that I was laying on this table. I remember telling my husband about it, and it literally felt like a weight on my chest, just like physical weight. And I heard God call me back to ministry. And I was like, what are you even talking about? Like, it's too late. It's too late. My kids are too young. We don't have the money to go. I can't go to college. You know, where would I even go? It's just, you know, you're going through all these things in your head, and that weight never left. And I told a couple people, and I remember one of the people I told, they're like, oh, you're the youth teacher, and you're lead pathfinders. That's what it is. And I was like, oh, okay. But like in my heart, I knew that wasn't it. But there were three people I told, Buster Swoops, who is my pastor, and Julie and Jason Burkhart, who were some close family friends. And they really prayed for me during this time. And over that next, like, I don't know, 6-9 months, I like really wrestled with God. I remember there were times because like I felt it every day. My job all of a sudden was not fulfilling. Like I could fake it really well. But something was missing, and I knew it at this point. And I'd have these arguments with God, and I was like, God, you either have to fulfill your call or you have to release it. Like you cannot give me this burden and then not fulfill it. And at this point, Buster starts mentoring me, and he starts to undo the damage of my childhood, those voices. And he starts to prepare me for something that I don't even know that God's about ready to do. And
He didn't know either.
He didn't know. He actually wasn't going to, he decided he was going to mentor a member. And he actually knew exactly who he was going to mentor. And it was not me. But he felt very convicted by God that it was supposed to be me. And so he told God, I'll do her next. But in the end, he called me and said, you know, I'd like to set up these weekly mentorship times. I think it was like for 12 weeks. We had a time. And after like the second time, he basically made me confront the inner voices in my head. And he made me text him every single day this statement like, I am smart, or I am this, or I don't even remember what
So
they
something
were.
positive about
Something
yourself.
positive about myself.
So those negative voices that you heard from teachers and other students back in childhood, you're now a fully grown woman with children and a good track record of success, but they don't leave you.
No.
They still...
And in a way, they ended up haunting my own children, because if you have this negative self-talk yourself, it's going to mess with the way you raise your own children, because you don't think you're worthy. You don't think you're good enough. And so you're always second guessing yourself. You're always doubting yourself. So he makes me do this exercise. We start thinking through, like, what are some ideas? What are some creative out of the box ideas of ways that I could kind of serve? I remember we talked about me creating like a program where I could go around and start going to churches and doing like weekend seminars.
Mm-hmm.
And we started trying to think like, what are things that I could talk about? And he really just kind of helped, one, remind me of my creativity and trying to find ways to use all of those talents that
In ministry.
in ministry. But it's like, how do you even get started in this and all this? And he even asked me, like, what is your dream job? Like, if you could have any job, what would your dream job be? And it was to work for the church, to kind of like be a think tank for the church, to be able to take and solve problems, to use social media, to be creative, to reach out, to be able to work with others closely and to inspire them, to just like all of this. And I said, and it'd be such a bonus if I could travel. Because like I've always wanted to travel. As a little girl, when I had that stamp album, I memorized every flag from every country. I know the names of probably more countries than most people do. Because as a little girl, my grandmother taught me this just love for the world. And so that was my bonus. If I could travel, that'd be great. So on July 2nd, I remember this day, I was totally asleep in bed. Totally asleep. And my husband comes in and he prays. And when he gets done praying, my husband basically says, if you want to tell me anything, God, go ahead. At this point, we're living in Texas. We've moved from Maryland to Texas. Because when we got married, we were living in Maryland. He was at the Review and Herald. We moved to Texas. And my husband heard 2 sentences. Get your house in order. You're moving to Maryland.
Okay.
I didn't really love our Maryland years. The early years of our marriage, I kind of struggled to figure out my identity. I'd moved from my parents' house directly into with my husband. I'd never really had something that was kind of like my own. I'd never had those years where you were kind of like really out on your own. And I struggled with friendship. The whole thing was just kind of, it wasn't my best years. Texas we loved. We literally had bought this home that my grandkids were going to come home to. Like it was everything I had ever wanted. And so the next day I see my husband, and this is July in Texas. It's like 100-degree heat. So it's like really ridiculously hot. And my husband's outside like cutting shrubs. And like, I'm like, what on earth are you even doing? And so at lunchtime, he's like, I need to tell you something. Because if it happens, I want you to know in advance and not me being like, hey, I knew this was going to happen. God told me. So he told me, and I was like, okay, let's get the house in order. We told the kids. I don't know why, because we've talked about going other places. We've never but this was so much like a God thing to him. He heard God speak this to him. And so we decided to live in faith. It made no sense whatsoever. Except that he had been doing some freelance work for the GC at that time. So my mind is like, he's going to get a job at the GC. I'm so excited. July 4th. So this is 2 days later, probably actually 36 hours. The person who he's working with came to Texas and they met with my husband for a couple hours and they talked about all their stuff. And in the back of my mind, the whole time I'm thinking like, maybe they're going to tell him about a job and, all this kind of stuff. And as she walks down the stairs, she turns and looks at me and she goes, Adventist World Radio is looking for a marketing manager. You should apply, but you'll have to move to Maryland.
Trigger words.
My husband immediately knew I had a job for Adventist World Radio. Every doubt I had ever had came flooding back to me. And I remember writing Buster.
Your pastor, mentor.
My pastor and mentor and friend. And he took a few minutes to respond. And when he did, he had taken every single statement I had read. Sorry. I'd done good up until now. He took every statement I had written about myself and he sent them in a list to me. And he said, wouldn't you hire her?
Mm.
And I remember I fudged a lot of those. Like some of my things were not that brilliant. because I struggled to see it. But I read the list and I was like, okay, I'd at least give this person a shot. So I applied. And 2-3 weeks later, I mean, it was a ridiculously short amount of time. We got notification while I was actually on a cruise with my husband that I was being hired to work for Adventist World Radio. I got off the cruise boat, flew home. The very next day, I flew up to the general conference. I had not, this is like, the whole thing is crazy, like the timeline. So Dwayne McKee saw past like job descriptions and like, do I have a degree in marketing? And he could see all the talents that God built. And so I ended up with this call. I end up at the GC. I'm here for 3 days. I'm trying to look for a house. I'm trying to enroll my kids in school. And I come back home, and in 1 week, my church family in Texas, the Crowley Seventh-day Adventist Church, who I love so desperately, they rallied around our family and packed our entire home in 1 week. And we drove out of our driveway that Sunday. Our church didn't even have time to process us leaving. Like, we were the Pathfinder directors. I think they actually had to not have a Pathfinder club for 1 year. And it was just like, it was very like, the whole thing was so quick. It was like, basically like we came home, we announced that God had done this, and the next week we're gone, kind of a thing. But the GC was wonderful. They allowed us to move very quickly because it was the very beginning of a school year. And my oldest was starting her freshman year in high school. And I was like, I don't want to bring her in like a month or two late. Like, it's just so hard to move kids during those middle school, high school years. So the HR here was fabulous. They really made it all work well. We moved into a hotel for 30 days. And for those of you who have watched past episodes, you've Aniel Barb and Mario Oliveira, their families, we all stayed in the same hotel together for 30 days. And we kind of ended up having our little hotel families, as we called. Actually, not Aniel. Was it Aniel? Yes. My brain is like going very quickly here. So the cool part was we ended up having these like families as soon as we came in, and it kind of helped the transition. We found a house, and I started working for Adventist World Radio as their first marketing manager.
And now your whole call to ministry materializes, and you start to work for the church in a mission-focused organization.
So something that's interesting, I realized, one, God did call me. He never actually released the calling. He actually had to wait for technology to catch up with what he wanted me to do. I'm currently working on my master's in pastoral ministry, and I'll explain that one in a second. But I'm working on my master's in pastoral ministry, and a classmate told me, because they kind of asked my story, and so I kind of said, what had happened and how someone said that the church didn't have a place for me. And they said, we're really glad that they said that. And I was kind of like taken aback, because this is my friend. Like, what are you saying? And he goes, because the church needs you where you're at. And if you had done that, you would not be where you are. And it was kind of
that's very insightful.
It was a very powerful thing to me, because like I hadn't really processed that. I would not be where I am. And I love what I do. It's literally my dream job. And so, yeah, I worked for Adventist World Radio for 2.5 years. I'm looking at you like you. Well, you do know this. So at this part of the story, you do know this story. So I worked for Adventist World Radio for 2.5 years. Social media, was able to come alongside and help, different team members with different projects, and it was so fantastic. I loved it. And it allowed me to start exploring what it's like to work for the church and to be able to use the talents and gifts that God gave me. Yeah.
For the last 3 years or so, You have,
3 years as of 2 days ago.
as of 2 days ago, there you
Yes.
go. Happy third anniversary. You have been leading the World Church channels, social media channels of this entire World Church. More recently, the English channels posted something that the whole world was like, whoa, is this? And there was a lot of contention around this post.
Thanks, Sam.
And you decided,
I so appreciate you
I-
bringing that moment
I'm
up.
going to put my photo up and I'm going to take full ownership of this thing. There's a team of over 100 people that work on these channels in all the languages. And how do you feel with this sense of responsibility that what you are publishing should reflect the beliefs, opinions, and thoughts of 22 million Seventh-day Adventists?
It's terrifying. We mess up sometimes. My favorite part of it is working with this team. I am going to cry again. I love them. We actually, they're like sisters and brothers. When one of us hurts, we all hurt. We feel each other's pain. The post that went viral for all the wrong reasons, it was an easy decision. It was an easy decision for me because there's an entire generation of young people who want nothing more than to be a part of this church. There's a generation of young people who are questioning every belief that they've ever had. And I wanted them to know that they were heard. And I could have put out a corporate statement. I don't think that's what this generation wants. They want leaders who are willing to take ownership. I could have thrown one of my people under the bus. It's not who I am. I didn't write it. I didn't design it. I didn't approve it. As a matter of fact, I didn't see it until someone brought it to my attention, because we put out 20,000 pieces of content a year.
20,000 pieces of original content a year.
I can't see all of it. We do have a whole checks and balances system, and I talked to the whole team one by one afterward, and we went through the whole process and what had happened. And in the end, all of them wanted to somehow take responsibility. And I was like, in the end, as Harry Truman said, he had this little plaque on his desk, and it says, "The buck stops here. In the end, I'm responsible." And I wanted those people who followed the church, I wanted them to have this little bit of a restoration of faith. And I felt like putting my face to it, let them know that they were heard by a person and not by a corporation. And I remember I went to bed that night. I went to bed before it went live. And what people don't, I love people to my core. It is who I am. It's never going to change. I actually was physically ill for 5 days. I kept waiting for it's not like, oh, the whole thing was so hard. And to wake up the next morning and the reaction wasn't what I had actually expected it to be when I went to bed. But I think that what young people are looking for is leaders who are willing to take ownership, both the good and the bad.
You have a different philosophy than normal communicators because you're more of a marketer than a communicator. And there is tension between those two worlds.
There is. And I feel it all the time.
All the time. And you, along with me and Williams and others that work in communication, we decided that all of our communication channels will be channels for mission, where the mission comes first and then our reputation comes second. So this is a tension between the communicators who want to focus on reputation management, and then you have the marketers that want to focus on sales. This is in the regular corporate world. And, you have some teams that have communication on the marketing and other companies that have marketing on the communication.
It's a whole mess out there.
And we resolved that in our case, evangelism and mission would be the priority. And you have decided that all of our channels will focus on three things.
Yes.
If I remember them correctly, the
You do.
first is
I've said them so many times to you. If you don't remember them correctly, I'm going to actually be very concerned.
helping people to know God first and foremost. It is his character that is at stake in the great controversy. So helping people to know who God really is. The second is helping people to know the Bible. What does the Bible actually say deeply?
But it's
properly?
also, I'm going to interrupt you. It's also that biblical illiteracy is very high right now.
Yes.
And so it's I call it the milk and the meat. Like it's not any good for me to give you like really theological stuff if you can't even find books in the Bible.
Mm-hmm. So it's not just the deep stuff, it is also the basic stuff.
Yeah, so this all kind of came out this last summer
Mm-hmm.
with me wrestling with God with what to do.
So
all this pivot is starting in 2024.
helping people to know God, helping people to know the Bible, and helping people to know the church.
Yes.
And in 2024, this will be the driving framework for everything that
Yes.
everybody publishes
If
across all of the channels.
it doesn't fit into this, then it doesn't go on our channels, which is going to make some people in this building possibly mad if I'm not willing to post something because it's the official church channels. But we're not a bulletin. I'm not just here to announce your events. We're a billboard. We're proclaiming something to everyone who drives by it.
Where do you think your ministry will take you next?
That's a really interesting question. So I had to write a paper to get into my master's. And one of the things that I said was that I had no idea where God wanted me to go, but I wasn't going to let a piece of paper stand in the way, which in some ways, if you don't have a diploma, certain doors don't open. I have no idea, because if you had asked me 7 years ago if I thought I'd be working in the General Conference, I would have laughed in your face. If you had even asked me when I worked at AWR if I would ever be an assistant director in the communication department, I would have laughed. None of this makes any sense. It still doesn't make sense to me. What I know is that God continues to lavishly pour out gifts on me. And any gift, any opportunity, any chance to learn, to grow, I will not waste. So I have no idea what that actually means. I have no idea where that takes me. Only God knows. He knows the end from the beginning. What I know is that no talent, no time will be left wasted.
And I cannot wait to have a second episode where we find out what happened from this point forward.
It's the after story.
Thank you for the vulnerability and for telling us your story.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of A&N Profiles with Alyssa Truman, who is normally your host. If you haven't already, please take a moment to subscribe to our podcast or YouTube channel, wherever you are tuning in from today. Of course, we don't want you to miss any future episodes. The stories that are told here are very interesting and inspiring. Thank you for sending your comments down in the YouTube comment. We read all of them. And also, thank you for spending this time with us. We hope that you join us next week. Alyssa will be back on this side of the room, of the chair. And we hope that we continue to get to know the life stories of more inspiring people.